Welcome to The Explainer. Listen, I am absolutely thrilled to unpack today's topic with you because we are looking at something genuinely terrifying. We're going to completely deconstruct this incredibly gripping Urdu horror narrative from the Horror Scary Stories blog called The Haunting of the Midnight Flight. If you love breaking down exactly how a story engineers tension, you are in for an absolute treat today. We're going to look strictly at this specific tale where a totally routine late-night journey just completely descends into a supernatural nightmare, and we're going to figure out exactly how it manages to get under our skin so effectively. All right, let's get right into it.
I want you to just picture this scenario for a second. It really is the ultimate vulnerability, isn't it? The protagonist in our source material finds himself strapped into a metal tube, hurtling through the sky at hundreds of miles per hour. Your feet are miles above the ground, and you have absolutely zero control over your environment. Right from the very beginning, the narrative taps into this grounded, deeply uncomfortable reality. I mean, when that unnatural cold begins to creep through the cabin in the story, you aren't in a haunted house where you can just, run out the front door. You are completely trapped.
Okay, so let's dive into the actual setting, the specific midnight flight, which the text describes as taking place in that eerie 3 a.m. dead zone. That isn't just some arbitrary time choice by the author. It is the perfect psychological canvas for terror. At that hour, the world outside that little reinforced window is just a void of absolute pitch-black nothingness. The normal rules of the day seem entirely suspended. Our circadian rhythms are practically screaming that we should be safely tucked into our beds, but instead, the protagonist is wide awake, suspended in the dark. It totally primes our brains to expect the unusual and ultimately the terrifying. Now, before the story even introduces a single supernatural element, the narrative masterfully weaponizes a very common psychological trigger: basic claustrophobia. An airplane cabin is pretty much the epitome of a confined space. By making us acutely aware of those narrow, dimly lit aisles, the low ceilings, and the tightly packed seats literally pressing in on the protagonist, the author cranks up the psychological tension way before any unnatural presence even makes an appearance. We're essentially suffocating before the real horror even begins.
The author builds on this tension by hyper-focusing on the mundane but honestly really unsettling details of a red-eye flight. Think about it. You've got the dim cabin lighting casting these long, weird shadows that, in this specific story, seem to linger just a bit too long against the bulkhead. You're surrounded by sleeping strangers, which ironically just amplifies the protagonist's deep isolation, because he's the only one awake to notice the temperature suddenly dropping. And then there's that constant droning hum of the engine. When you frame these totally normal travel conditions through a horror lens, they suddenly feel incredibly sinister.
Shifting our focus to the physical reality of the airplane environment itself, the story brilliantly uses altitude to just skyrocket the stakes. In the narrative, heavy turbulence hits right before the haunting truly kicks off. At 30,000 feet, the stakes are literally as high as they can get. The physical isolation perfectly mirrors the protagonist's psychological isolation. Every single jolt of turbulence, every weird mechanical groan, it all feels magnified because your margin for error up there is practically zero. The altitude actually becomes this invisible antagonist all on its own. Now, the chronological pacing of the horror in the source material is incredibly deliberate. The rising altitude directly mirrors the rising action of the plot. We start with boarding, right? Which represents that initial vulnerability of stepping into the confined space. Then, takeoff, when the protagonist hears that heavy, final mechanical thud of the cabin door sealing shut, officially cutting everyone off from the outside world. And finally, reaching cruising altitude, ascending into complete, inescapable darkness where the supernatural elements actually begin to manifest. Structurally, it's a literal upward trajectory into terror. Just let that sink in for a moment. This massive, inescapable fact is the linchpin of the entire narrative. Unlike almost any other setting in horror literature, a pressurized cabin in the sky offers absolutely no physical means of escape. There is this chilling moment in the text when the protagonist fully realizes the sheer impossibility of fleeing the encroaching presence. They look down the narrow aisle, entirely blocked by sleeping bodies, and realize they are totally cornered. It creates this intense pressure cooker environment where the reader feels exactly as trapped as the passenger. So let's look at the core conflict of the source material. The narrative is so fascinating because it blends the rich, traditional cultural flavors of Urdu horror storytelling with this highly universal, very modern anxiety. I mean, instead of just a generic ghost, the story invokes the terrifying presence of a jinn, an unseen, ancient entity born of smokeless fire, which manifests as a malformed shadow creeping along the airplane's ceiling. It takes this ancient, deeply cultural fear and drops it into the most technologically advanced, sterilized environment possible. It's just a fantastic, terrifying contrast. Notice the major shift in the passenger's mindset here. We all have rational flight fears, right? Turbulence, maybe engine failure, or just a general fear of heights. But the story masterfully takes those grounded anxieties and twists them into sheer supernatural dread. In the text, what initially sounds like a violently rattling overhead bin, which is a perfectly normal, if annoying, flight occurrence, slowly reveals itself to be the jinn actively tampering with the physical space. The physical isolation completely turns into paranormal isolation. It basically hijacks our logical brain and replaces it with pure, irrational panic.
Structurally speaking, the author uses a very specific mechanical process to psychologically trap us right alongside the protagonist. Step 1. They ground us in a highly relatable reality. Finding your seat, settling in for a long, boring flight. Step 2. They introduce an eerie anomaly, like that sudden, unnatural freezing temperature, or the whispering voice heard just under the engine's hum. And finally, Step 3. They remove all means of escape. Once that heavy cabin door is sealed and they are miles above the earth, boom, the trap is sprung.
So why does this specific story linger so effectively in the mind long after you've finished reading it? Well, it really comes down to the underlying psychology of fear. The narrative essentially forces us to confront our total lack of control. When we fly, we are literally surrendering our lives to physics and to machines we don't fully understand. The story brilliantly highlights this by having the cabin lights aggressively flicker and the intercom system emit only dead static when the jinn approaches. When the supernatural infects that trusted technological space, our entire system of trust just completely shatters.
This haunting works so flawlessly because it attacks our deepest, most primal psychological vulnerabilities right when we are supposed to be resting. It taps directly into our ancient fear of the pitch-black void right outside the window. It totally exploits our complete vulnerability while sitting helpless among unconscious strangers. And it subverts our absolute reliance on the unseen machinery keeping us in the air. Machinery that, frankly, offers zero protection against an ancient entity. The story strips away all our modern comforts and just leaves us completely exposed.
30,000. That single number is really all you need to understand the sheer physical distance from safety here. It grounds the supernatural, ethereal fear of a jinn in a terrifying, cold mathematical reality. The entity in the story is inherently scary, absolutely, but the fact that you have to face it 30,000 feet in the air, with absolutely nowhere to go but down, that is exactly what elevates this narrative into a true masterclass of atmospheric horror.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought. After exploring the brilliant mechanics of this Urdu horror tale and really understanding how it manipulates our senses, our claustrophobia, and our inherent trust in modern travel, how are you going to feel the next time you board a late-night flight? Will you be able to just ignore the dim lights, the sleeping strangers, and the droning hum of the engine? Or will you be watching the shadows? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and hey, safe travels.